Nearly 80 years after New York State was formed, the last county was created. Why was that so? And what's the interesting story behind the story of Western New York's youngest county? We'll learn that more on this week's State of Greater Western New York report, brought to you by... Each week, our community makes history. Each week, you make history. And each week, there's only one source to turn to for the first take on history. You know what that is? Subscribe to the Sentinel right now to discover the history being made in your own backyard. The Men in Honey Lake Falls Lima Sentinel. More than just your news, it's your history. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Join us each episode as we discuss fantastic topics ranging from history to science to the strange and the wonderful, as well as the treasured spirit with which our region has infused America. We challenge you to consider all things Greater Western New York, from our region's very beginnings to how it inspires, how it empowers, and why it is so admired. Here's the host of the State of Greater Western New York Report, Chris Carosa. Hi there, everybody, and welcome to this week's version of the State of Greater Western New York Report. I'm Chris Carosa, and with me today is our guest, Gary Emerson. Gary is the Schuyler County historian. Gary, how are we doing today?
Very well, thank you.
All right. Got a little noise in the background, but that's okay. Hey, Gary, tell us a little bit about yourself and actually how you came to become the Schuyler County historian.
Well, I was a public high school social studies teacher for 36 years, and then I retired about 8 years ago. And when I retired, I decided I wanted to go back to school, so I went back to school at Binghamton University, and I'm actually working on a PhD right now in American history, and I'm almost getting finished. I'm up to the stage where I'm writing my dissertation. So, and I've always had a real interest in the local history around here in Schuyler County. I've lived here since 1977, and when the post of the historian became vacant, I was nominated for it by the county legislature and approved, so I've been doing that for about the past 5 years now. I've been the county historian.
Very good. So tell us a little bit about the history of Schuyler County. You know, when did it form? Why did it form? And give us some notion of what it's all about.
Well, our county is in what was the Seneca Indian land, part of the Iroquois nations, and the town of Montour Falls was known as Catherine's Town, named after Montour. She was known by the whites as Queen Catherine Montour. So if you drive along Route 14, you'll see this sign that marks the site of the village. And then, of course, in 1779, the Sullivan Campaign was sent through this area and destroying many of the Indian villages. And Catherine's Town was one of the villages that they destroyed at the time. And, but as the men of the Sullivan Campaign came through here, they noticed all the lakes and the waterways and streams, and they thought, well, maybe this could all be united somehow. We could have a system of interconnecting waterways, and eventually that's going to lead to the building of a whole canal system through New York State. And of course, after the war, the military tract was created, and part of our county was in that military tract. So this map shows the military tract along the eastern shore of Seneca Lake, and the area marked Hector is in our county. So Hector and Burdett were part of the military tract lands, and soldiers were awarded that land for their service in the war. And but in many cases, a lot of the men didn't actually come here to settle. They sold their land to other people. But there were some men who went on the Sullivan Campaign that did settle in our area. And then I mentioned, well, around 1788, settlers began arriving here following the path of the Sullivan Campaign. And eventually they did complete that dream of the Sullivan Campaign soldiers, of the idea of connecting having interconnecting waterways. And they built the Chemung Canal, which opened in 1833. It connected the Chemung River to Seneca Lake, and it gave them a way to get to the Erie Canal. And with that canal, trade really started to boom, and towns grew. You got a cash economy. It really changed the demography as well. You had a lot more Irish coming in, whereas before a lot of people were New Englanders. So it brought a whole new population to live here. And this photo shows, the previous photo showed a picture of Montour Falls, known as Havana in those days. And it showed the canal coming down. This painting's in the Montour Falls Library, and I like this because it shows the canal coming through the village of Montour Falls, and you can see the canal boats. And of course, right along the next side of it was a railroad as well, which eventually is going to put the canals out of business. Once the canal boats got to Seneca Lake, they were towed by steamboats north to Geneva, and then they could get from there to the Erie Canal. And the steamboats really did a lot to also improve transportation and brought tourists to the area. Here's a picture of a steamboat called the Seneca that was tied up in the harbor in Watkins Glen in the 1800s. And as trade boomed and the towns grew, talk began of creating a new county. And the real spearhead of this was a man named Charles Cook. Charles Cook wanted to have a new county. He saw himself as like a Peter Cooper of the area. He wanted to develop his village of Havana, which is today Montour Falls, much like Peter Cooper developed Cooperstown. And he wanted to plan out this village, and he had a lot of control and owned a lot of land around the village and did a lot of things for the village. So in 1854, the county got created. And they took land from Chemung County and Steuben County and Tompkins County to create this new county of Schuyler County. People didn't like the fact that if they had to do any kind of legal business, they had to travel all the way to Elmira in Chemung County to do it. And that meant they basically lost a whole day traveling there and then another whole day traveling back. And it was kind of a pain in the neck for them. So they wanted to have their own county so it was closer to where they lived. As the railroads grew and the canals grew, you started to have more people coming in. So there were a lot of hotels in the area. Oh, here's a picture of the county, how it looks with the various townships in it. And so as people began traveling to the area for what they called excursions, traveling on the railroads and the steamboats, the town of Watkins Glen began to develop many very large hotels. This is one of the most famous ones. It's no longer there now, but it was the Jefferson House, built by Dr. Samuel Watkins in 1834, and it was there until around 1978 before it was torn down. Another hotel, I think we have a picture of it, is the Glen Park Hotel. It was a very large hotel. It's kind of like a spa in those days, which was between 12th and 14th Streets in Watkins Glen. And there were other hotels as well around the village. So people came from all over the place by rail and by steamboat to come and stay in Watkins Glen and tour and see the beauty of the area. And soon industry began to develop as well. One industry that developed in Watkins Glen was the salt industry. They were drilling for oil in 1883, and they didn't really find any oil, but they found salt on their drill bits. And so they decided instead of drilling for oil, we'll go for salt. And what they would do is they would drill down to the level where the salt was. They would pump in hot water to dissolve the salt, and then they would pump the water out and then evaporate it to get the salt out. So the salt business became a very big business in Watkins Glen. And this also changed the demography a little bit. Many Italians were coming over in the 1890s, and they came to Watkins Glen to work for these salt companies. So there's still a large Italian population in Watkins Glen today. Another big industry that developed around the lake was grapes. So agriculture is still a big industry around our area, and grape growing is primarily one of the main things. And so they harvest these grapes. There's many, many wineries along the lake. People come and tour the wineries. We get lots of people visiting the wineries along the lakes. There's many, many different kinds of wineries all along the east and west shores of Seneca Lake. So that attracts a lot of tourists to this day. And people still visit the area for its natural beauty as well. I mean, here's the falls in Montour Falls called Chiquagua Falls that people come and see. I just had a tour group come in recently a couple of weeks ago from Ohio, and they were really fascinated with these falls. They're very, very beautiful. And how many villages at the end of the main street have this gorgeous waterfall tumbling along. And but that's not the only waterfall. There's also Eagles Cliff Falls in Havana Glen. There's many falls in the gorge at Watkins Glen, which people come to visit as well. So the natural beauty still attracts a lot of people to Schuyler County as well. And then, of course, another big thing in our county is racing. In 1948, a gentleman named Cameron Argesinger, who vacationed in Watkins Glen, thought it would be a good idea to have a road race through the village streets. So in 1948, they had the first Grand Prix in Watkins Glen. So drivers came in and they drove right through the village streets. They put up big bales of hay along the streets, and crowds lined the streets, as you can see in this picture, to watch the race cars go flying by. And they did that until around 1951, and then it stopped, and they built a racetrack outside of town to host the races there. And that track is still there. And every year they have a big NASCAR race that comes in to Watkins Glen, and it draws in sometimes as many as 100,000 people come watch this race in August every year. So racing is another big thing that Watkins Glen is known for. Did you want to talk about the Sullivan Campaign now at this point?
Well, actually, we had a couple of quick questions that we got from the audience. One is, I'm going to go reverse chronological order. So is the reason why you have a lot of grapes and wines because the Italians came in? Did they bring that with them, or did that come up somewhere else?
Yeah, it actually started before that. I think a lot of it is attributed to Constantine Frank, was a guy who started the grape growing over along Cutica Lake near Hammondsport, and it caught on along the other Finger Lakes. It was just a good environment for growing grapes. The lakes helped moderate the temperatures and made it good for grape growing. So it spread from there to Seneca Lake and the other Finger Lakes, and so they actually preceded the arrival of the Italian population. This got going right around the time of the Civil War, when grape growing got its start in the Finger Lakes.
So the next question really probably is a little bit more involved in terms of the answer. We have a few more minutes before our first break. The process of becoming a new county. So you mentioned the motivation was basically to bring things closer, so that people didn't have to travel a whole day to get their business done. But what was the process of bringing a new county into being? Do you recall if there was any opposition to it, or was it something that was done quite easily?
Yes, there was opposition to it. I mean, the counties that lost the land to create Schuyler County, none of them liked it. They all opposed it. But the had to be approved by the New York State Legislature, and Cook was able to work to get the votes to get that done. The other problem was choosing a name for the county. Cook wanted to name it Montour County because he was always fascinated with Queen Catherine Montour and the Indian history. So he wanted to name this Montour County. And for some reason or another, that was decided that was not a good name. And people then wanted to name it Webster County after Daniel Webster, the famous senator and from Massachusetts. And then at the last minute, someone decided it would be Schuyler County, named after Philip Schuyler, a general in the American Revolution. So that's what it ended up being named for. Even though Philip Schuyler never set foot in our county, we got named after him.
I think that's pretty common. There's a lot of counties that are named after people who never actually were there, but that's okay. I mean, it's interesting that the county is so young. Is there any sort of like how like when you're the youngest kid in the family, you kind of feel a certain way? Do you guys feel a certain way because you're the youngest county in the Greater Western New York region?
I don't know. I don't know as I've ever had any conversation with anybody where we felt like we were slighted in any way. I don't know. So I guess I can't really give you a good answer for that.
How big is the county? How many people are in that county?
It's about 18,000 people in the county. Yeah.
And how many towns I forgot how many were on the map. There were
I forgot too. Yeah. Towns? No, I don't think there were that many. There was townships. There's about 5 townships. And one was created at the last minute. The town of, actually this map doesn't show the town of Montour. There's another town called Montour, that Charles Cook created because he wanted another vote in the county legislature to make sure that his village of Havana, Montour Falls, got to be the county seat. So he created another township to make sure he had an extra vote. So he was a little bit of a political schemer, Charles Cook.
All right. Well, so that's, whoops, what happened to our little thing here? Well, let's go back. Let's take a break now and go to commercial, and we'll be right back. Through the mists of time, nature and man have both created and buried treasures beyond the imagination. With the ages, these riches slowly dissolve into mere myths until they are forever forgotten. But there are those brave souls who tirelessly cling to the truth, ever seeking to discover the undiscovered, to reveal what has always been there, to uncover the hidden gems of a land thought forsaken but loved by millions. 50 Hidden Gems of Greater Western New York. Discover the secrets in your own backyard. Buy your copy now at 50hiddengems.com. Welcome back to the State of Greater Western New York Report. I'm Chris Carosa, and this week's guest is Gary Emerson, the historian of Schuyler County. Gary's going to tell us a little bit about some history before the county was actually formed, and this history is actually critical to the development of the Greater Western New York region. And Gary, why don't you just go ahead and take it away, introduce us on the topic of the Sullivan Campaign, maybe why it happened, where it happened, and then specifically how it impacted Schuyler County.
Well, the Sullivan-Clinton campaign happened in 1779, and the reason it happened was that the frontier settlements in western Pennsylvania and in the western part of New York State were being attacked by Tories and Native Americans and getting their homes burned, and people were getting killed and scalped. And the Native Americans were angry because they were encroaching on their land and they wanted these people to get out. So they sided with the British and they were attacking these Americans in the frontier settlements. And two of the worst attacks happened at Wyoming Valley near Wilkes-Barre in Pennsylvania, and also another one at Cherry Valley in New York in the central part of the state up near Cooperstown. So the people on the frontier were demanding that something be done to protect them. And they're begging George Washington and Congress to do something. So Washington in 1779 came up with the idea of the Sullivan-Clinton campaign. He would put together this army of men led by General Sullivan and Generals Clinton, and they would go and invade the Iroquois territory and burn the villages in retribution for what had been happening on the frontier. The idea was they hoped that it would stop the raids on the frontier. Ultimately, it did not, but that was the goal of this raid. And so Sullivan and Clinton had their march through this area, burning all these villages. And see the route of the march here on the map here. Sullivan came up from Pennsylvania and Clinton came from the Albany area, and they joined up at Tioga in Pennsylvania near the border with New York State. And then together they marched through the Finger Lakes area, burning all these villages. And there was a battle at Newtown, which was near Elmira, New York. And Sullivan and his men Sullivan had about 4,000 men, and they were up against, at the Battle of Newtown, they were standing up against about 700 Indians and Tories and a few British regulars. So it was kind of a mismatch, and they overwhelmed them. And after the Battle of Newtown, the Tories and Indians retreated back to Catherinestown in our county. And there was a big debate about what they should do. And many of the women felt that they should just give up to Sullivan and Clinton. But the Tory leader, John Butler, and the Mohawk leader, Joseph Brand, said, absolutely not. We're all leaving. Everybody's coming. We're going to get out of here. If you give yourselves up to them, because usually as hostages and force us to give in to them. So after the Battle of Newtown, they marched northward. Sullivan's army marched northward towards Catherinestown. And you see on the map on the right there that it shows the route of their march. They went to Kanawha Hollow, which was a village along the Chemung River in what's today Elmira. Then they marched up to the village of what's today Horseheads. And then they marched to this swamp that you see on the map there. It's Great Pine Swamp. And this was like one of the worst parts of the Sullivan Clinton campaign. If you read the diaries of the soldiers, they all say that this was terrible going, getting through this awful swamp. And when they came out of it, they finally arrived at Catherinestown on September 1st, 1779, about 9 or 10 o'clock at night. They got there. And they found the village abandoned when they got there. And there's a entry of from Adam Hubley's diary that talks about their arrival in the village. And he talks about finding, there were howling dogs as they arrived. They went in and checked the place out, and they found that they left it, and they encamped there, and they tore down some of the houses and used it for firewood. And I mean, we always learn in schools that the Iroquois lived in long houses, but that's not what they're finding at the time of the American Revolution in the Sullivan Clinton campaign. The Native Americans basically were living in log cabins, much like the whites were on the frontier. Only they found out that these savages weren't quite as savage as they made them out to be. At Elmira, at Kanawha, when they destroyed that village, they found these cabins that had feather beds. They had nice furniture in them. They had wooden floors, glass windows. And they thought, well, these so-called savages are actually living better than we are in our frontier settlements. So they learned some things about the Native Americans that kind of surprised them. And this is a sketch here of one of the Sullivan's soldiers made of their encampment at Catherinestown. So you can see they show that there was a cornfield there, and there were also orchards that ran into what is now the village of Montour Falls, and they destroyed all the houses they found there. They said that they found 30 or 40 houses. They also found that they had horses and cattle. They had hogs. They had these large orchards. And they destroyed all the trees in the orchard. They burned all the crops. They burned all the houses. They did leave one house for a very old woman they found there. And she was scared to death what they were going to do to her, but she was very, very old. Some said they thought she was 100 years old. But Sullivan took mercy on her and left her one of the buildings to stay in, and even left her some of their food so she had something to live off of. And so they destroyed this village, and they moved on, going along the east side of Seneca Lake. And they also destroyed some other villages along the way. There was one called Peach Orchard that was burned on the east shore of Seneca Lake. And when they returned after getting as far as Geneseo, they kind of came back the same way they went in a lot of cases. And they came back to the Catherinestown, found the old woman still there, still doing okay. And when they got back to Horseheads, what's today Horseheads, their pack horses were all pretty much shot. So they killed the pack horses, and when the first settlers arrived, they found the skulls of the horses lined up along the trail leading to Catherinestown. And that's why the village got the name Horseheads as a result of that. So people see that as kind of an odd name, but it goes back to the Sullivan Clinton campaign. And then the 1780s, settlers started coming in, and there were still a few hundred Indians still living in the area. Some said that Queen Catherine came back to Montour Falls after the Revolution and lived there by herself. And when she died, this old woman was buried there. But it's really pretty much disputed about whether this was really Catherine Montour or not, and whether or not she actually came back. Other sources say she was living in Canada in the 1790s. So we're not really certain this woman was her, that she ever came back here. But there is a memorial stone to her on the little hill where her house was said to have been. And again, it's not really a gravestone, it's just a memorial stone. You still see it today. It's just off the trail. That there's trail called the Catherine Valley Trail, which was an old railroad bed that's been turned into a hiking, biking trail. And there's a little side route you can take over here. You can see the site where Catherine's town was, and you'll see this memorial stone. And you also will see a turtle mound that was built by an actual Seneca Indian in the 1990s. He came back here and built this turtle mound as a memorial to Catherine's town and Queen Catherine Montour. So that's there as well, right near the memorial stone we just saw a picture of. And, so the town eventually got to be named Montour Falls. Originally it was Havana, but was changed in 1895 to be Montour Falls to also honor Catherine Montour. So there's a number of place names around today that date back to the time of when the Native Americans were around. The Sullivan Campaign happened. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, so let's talk a little bit about Catherine Montour, because she, or rather her sister, was an inspiration, one of the inspirations for the Sullivan Campaign. Esther Montour, who was also Queen Esther, they called her that, supposedly was involved in the Wyoming County massacre. This is Wyoming County, Pennsylvania now, where witnesses were said to have seen her, I guess, commit war crimes is what we would call them in today's language, but back then it was just war. And it was a very horrific scene, and that was in part what inspired George Washington to ask Sullivan to go and do his march. But the odd thing was, years later, some historians said that there was evidence it might have been Catherine, and then other historians say, well, the whole thing is a made-up tale. What are your thoughts about that, and what side of this do you fall on?
Well, I fall on the side that I think it's a made-up tale. I don't think it actually happened, but there are people who steadfastly believe that this really happened, that Esther Montour slaughtered these men around this rock that's known as Bloody Rock, which you can still go and see in Wyoming, Pennsylvania today. But I think it was just a manufactured tale that probably never happened. It was all to generate hatred for the Native Americans and support for things like the Sullivan Clinton campaign and for pushing the Native Americans off their land. But I've read accounts of this, and there's the descriptions of Esther Montour are just so varied. Just helps make it not very believable. I mean, some described her as being heavy, some said she was thin, some said that she was very unkempt, some said she was very well dressed, some said she couldn't speak any English, some said that she could. And other people say that she was seen at the site of her area of her village the day before. I don't think it's very likely she paddled a canoe all the way down the Susquehanna River and did this act in such a short amount of time, unless she had a small motor on her boat. I don't think it had happened. So I fall on the side that I think this is all a myth that was made up during the Revolution. I mean, the white settlers wanted to have a common cause and to support the war. One of those common causes was hatred for the Indians. And there was a real hatred for them. It became really racially motivated against them.
Right. Well, like I said, it's too bad they didn't have cell phones back then, or else we would have indisputable evidence of what really happened.
Yes, right.
It's really hard to go back in that time, because even though the Sullivan Campaign itself is journaled very largely, I mean, we do know some horrific acts that occurred around, where was it, the Livingston County, and that comes from multiple sources from both sides, so that we can verify that. But even within the Wyoming County massacre, to some extent, the Cherry Valley massacres, and Germantown massacre, you don't have a complete history on it. You have supposed eyewitness reports, but they aren't necessarily corroborated in a way that gives you a lot of confidence. Still, it's interesting. It's interesting because of this. I think kind of what you say. This is a motivating factor. Whether it's true or not, this is what people believed, and that caused them to take actions. Now, we do know that the Iroquois and the Tories were, in fact, terrorizing what was then the western frontier of New York Colony. Now, western frontier isn't very west. It's not that far from Albany.
Right.
But so that's a fact, and the Sullivan Campaign itself, I think, probably later on inspired Sherman's march during the Civil War. And in fact, Sherman came to, I think, Rochester when they rededicated was it the burials of Boyle and Parker? Gave a speech, and mentioned that. So this is a pretty significant thing from a military standpoint, but we're less concerned about that than the idea that this is the first time that the Americans really saw, in a broad way, really saw the beauty of the greater Western New York region, and that in turn brought them closer to wanting to settle here, and in fact they did settle here. Well, you
mentioned Sherman.
Go ahead.
Sherman also spoke at the dedication of the Newtown Monument in 1879.
Right.
So he was seen as an appropriate speaker because he did the same kind of thing at Sullivan Clinton.
Right. Well, I want to thank everybody for watching today's show. We've reached that point where it's time to say goodbye. If you want to be part of the audience, we've had a couple people on today for our live audience where you can answer and ask questions. Probably more ask the questions than answer them. But just go to Greater Western New York, stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com, and you can sign up to get an invitation to this audience, to be an audience. It's free, and it's every Thursday at noon. We do archive these immediately, so you'll be able to see them on our site. Or if you're a member of our Facebook page or YouTube channel, it's rebroadcast every Sunday at 1:30, which makes it a challenge during football season. But hey, this week's game is Sunday night, so you don't have to worry about that. So for everybody here, I want to thank Greg for being a part of today's show. Thank you for listening and watching, and we'll see you next week.